Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Securing Your ESXi Hosts. So now let's talk a little bit about the actual security settings and some of the options on the vSphere host. So first, let's talk about some config files. Some of these may be reviews, some may be new. We'll be bouncing back and forth between the lab and the slides as we go along. So, a few config files to keep in mind. First, if you want to change anything in SSH, you can find those under /etc/SSH. The main one is sshd_config. Often the only reason you change that is maybe you want to create a local user account and use that for SSH instead of root. A lot of environment security policy states root is not allowed for remote access, so you can disable that, and we'll take a look at that in a second. The next directory we want to look at is for your SSL certificate, so /etc/vMware/SSL, and again we'll talk about this one in a minute. For your firewall, the basic config for your different services that you see in your firewall allow deny list are in /etc/vMware/firewall/service.xml. And then you have your ESXconf file, which has a whole ton of information, /etc/vMware/esx.conf. So let's take a quick look at those. I'm logged in or SSH'd into a host, so let's do SSH first if I learn to type. And that is sshd_config, and I'm using the VI text editor. A little word on that. If you're not good with VI or not have used it at all, I suggest you go through a VI primer, you connect into some of your hosts, and you practice a little bit. You need to know how to edit config files and save them directly on a vSphere host. So I suggest you at least get rudimentary skills on that. I'm not a great VI expert by any stretch, but I can log in, replace things, insert stuff, and save them back. And I suggest you learn that as well. Permit root login. So if we set this to no, save this and restart SSH, which we can do either through a services command here or through the GUI, it will then not allow, or disallow, I guess I was trying to say, the root user to log in. You'd have to have another local user. So that's normally the reason we would edit this file, unless you want to change something like, idle timeouts or something, but that's basically it. So you set that there. And then we have this etc VMware directory tree, and the ESXconf file stores all kind of local information. This is basically the config file that gets read at boot and sets everything up from port groups to network information to storage information, just all kind of your settings, all that stuff. And you can go through here. I don't expect you to need to edit this during the exam, but it's an important config file. It's it's one of the things I think are kind of touched on in the blueprint, so I want to make sure it's covered. But the neat thing is, I'll just give you a little tip here if you've never used this file. One area that I jumped to here is your VM NICs. This is what maps your physical PCI NICs to what their names are, VM NIC 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you've ever swapped NIC cards and it reordered your VM NICs and all your port groups got messed up, this is where you can fix that. You can come edit that, reorganize them the way you want to, reboot the host, and they'll come up in the correct order. I've actually seen firmware updates cause this to get reset before, and it's a great idea to go ahead, come in here and reset them back. So that's my handy little tip to you. We've had to do this a number of times, but again, I don't expect you to need to know anything about how to get around that file for the exam. Next are vSwitch security options. So again, we've kind of touched on these when we went through them in the networking section, but I'm going to do it again because it's security, and I want to make sure you get it. And it's also under this section in the blueprint. So the three main security options are promiscuous mode, MAC address changes, and forged transmits. Promiscuous mode is simple. Do you allow a VM to put its virtual NIC in promiscuous mode and start sniffing all the frames it sees going through the connected port group in vSwitch? Yes or no. Normally you set that to no. MAC address changes and forged transmits go hand in hand, and they're often confused. So the simple answer is, if you want a VM to be able to change its MAC address to something other than what's stored in its VMX file or in the config, you need to set these to allow, or I guess you need to set them to accept. So MAC address changes says if set to accept, a connected VM can change its MAC address, and incoming frames will be passed. So frames from the network into the vSwitch into the VM. I don't know why I did this definition backwards, but if set to reject, any outbound frame with a source MAC that is different from one currently set on the adapter are dropped. Basically, it means MAC address changes allows a VM to change its MAC and receive frames from the network. Forged transmits allows a VM to change its MAC address and send frames to the network. So if you want a VM to change its MAC address and both send and receive, you need to set both of those to accept. Local groups and users. So, like I said, you can disable root and maybe create other local users to use. So you don't have to use root, and you can give that user shell access. The process is real simple. You connect the VI client direct to the host. You have to connect it to the host, not through vCenter. Click the Local Users Groups tab, choose Users or Groups, right-click and choose Add, and then enter the needed information. So I have direct connected this VI client to this host, and it popped up and said, hey, this guy's also being managed by the vCenter server. Don't break anything, so I'll try not to. But you go to the server, you go over to Users and Groups, and at the top you got View Users and View Groups. So we'll click Users. Right-click, Add, and we can add a user. So I'll add Jason. This is your user ID. You can see that here. By default, it'll start manually your extra added user IDs, I guess at 1,000. If you don't enter one, it'll just index to the next one. The username is optional, but I'll put it. Make sure your passwords match. That allows SSH or shell access. And then if you want to add it to a group, you can. By default, there are no local groups, but you can add it. And actually, I'm on 5.1, and in 5.1, they have deprecated local groups. So those don't work anymore, which is another reason there aren't any. And we say OK. If I want to add a group and I'm not on 5.1, you would click Add. You'd enter in the information. I'd add the user that I want to add, like my JSON account, plus any others I'd want to add, such as DCUI, which is a built-in account. And I'd hit OK. And you, if you're doing it on 5.0, would not get an error like I just got right here. That's basically saying it's not allowed anymore because I'm on 5.1. But for 5.0, since that's what the VCAP 5 is on, if you get asked, that's how you do it. Then we have roles and permissions. So once the user is created, you can assign roles and permissions. Roles are a set of privileges, what they can and cannot do. And the easiest way to do this is to clone an existing one and make changes. You can make a new one if you only want to select a few things, but a lot of times you want to clone the administrator one and deselect what you don't want them to be able to do. But again, it's up to you, whichever you think is the quickest path to get to the end result. And then you combine a user with a role to give it permissions. So remember this, permissions equals role plus user. Let's go back. So I have created a user called Jason. Now, where do I do roles? It's not here. Users and groups are local. Permissions are local to this object. To do roles, I go back to home and it's under the main screen. So by default, we have 3 roles: no access, read only, and administrator, and it shows you who on the right has those roles. So if we want to create one, we right click this one and we'll just do clone. So I'll do one is vCAP demo role. Click it, right click it, and do edit. And then you go through and pick and choose what you don't want them to have access to. Whatever. And you say OK. Then we go back to the server, go over to permissions, right click, and say add permission. So then we say which user group. I will add Jason. Check the name. Show users first. Jason. Add. Hit OK. There we go, finally. And then the role. So the vCAP demo. So I combined a user with a role. You can tell if you want to inherit to child and hit OK. And that is how we create a new permission. So remember, it's a 3-step process. You got to create the user or group. You got to create the role, or pick an existing one, and then you combine them together to create a permission. So now let's talk about customizing SSH settings. So by default, SSH is disabled. You enable that either through the DCUI menu or the VI client. Then you can set the SSH timeout. So under the VI client, you can go to host, software, advanced settings, user variables, and there's your timeout. And there's actually 2. I'm going to show them to you in a second, explain the difference. You can do it via the CLI using the ESXCFG-advanced config command, and all you're doing is setting that advanced setting for ESXi shell timeout, right, and also ESXi interactive shell timeout, which I'll show you in a minute. Or you can do it from the DCUI. So let's take a look at that. Let's go to the one for vCenter. So we go to the host that we want to mess with, go to configuration, and let's see, we want to go to security profile, and properties for services. So we do that by doing ESXi shell, options, and start it, and then we can set our options. We'll talk about these startup policies. Well, let's talk about them now, and then we'll review them in the slides since I'm already here. So start and stop with host is the most common. Basically means when the host boots up, I start the ESXi shell. When I shut it down, I stop it. If you want to do it manually, you can just say I'll come in here and hit start on ESXi shell, use it when I need it, and then I'll manually stop it. Or you can start automatically if any ports are open and stop when they are closed. So basically, if the ports get open, it'll stay running. If it shuts the ports down, it'll shut the service down. Don't see this one used very often. That's kind of an odd one. Normally, for most things, we start and stop with a host because we want them to always be running. So you can start that there as well as any of your other services. SSH, if you want to, actually, that's for the shell. We were talking about SSH a minute ago, weren't we? Same thing here. Normally, I want SSH to start and stop. If you only want SSH for limited time, some people don't want to enable SSH all the time. Again, security policies run amok. You can start and stop manually, and if you need to get to a host, start it, and then when you're done, you can stop it. That's up to you. There's actually another way to do that. I'll show you now. Next is your timeout settings. So again, host configuration, software, advanced settings. Scroll down to user variables, user vars, and then it's user vars ESXi shell timeout. So you've got two. So interactive shell timeout is basically an idle timeout. That means if I set this and it's set in seconds, if I set this to 120, if I SSH into my host and walk away from my computer in 2 minutes, it will kick me out. That's normally in a security policy as well. That way you don't walk away from a logged in terminal. This one says if you start the SSH service and you have a policy that says SSH should not be enabled except when needed, one problem is people enable it, log in, SSH in, do what they need to do, log out, and forget to stop the service. You can actually say ESXi shell timeout will stop that service after X number of seconds. So once you start it, this tells it how long to leave it running, and then it will shut it down later if it needs to. So you may want to say it's only allowed for an hour. So you do 60 minutes times 60 seconds, 3600, and set it for that. But that's the difference. So if you want an idle timeout, it's interactive timeout. If you just want to stop the service after an hour or something, it's ESXi shell timeout. So know the difference. Certificate checking, so it's enabled by default. You change this within the VI client, and basically what it says is vCenter will verify the validity of the SSL certificate of the remote host when establishing a connection. And all it says is that every time an ESX host reboots and reconnects to vCenter, it's going to confirm that the certificate it's offering is the same one it got that when we reconnected, and it prevents man-in-the-middle attacks. I'd show you this, but it's been removed from the 5.1 VI client. Much to my dismay, I went to take a screenshot and it wasn't there, so I had a friend of mine send this from his 5.0 lab. But it is done. You go into VI client, administration at the top, vCenter server settings, and then SSL settings right there, and it's basically just a checkbox. Host certificate. So if you rename a host or accidentally delete the existing certificate, you may need to generate a new one, or new ones, I guess. Or if you want to install your own from your own certificate authority. So certificates are stored in the ETSI VMware SSL directory. There are two of them. There's rui.crt certificate and rui.key, which is your key file. Back these up if you make changes. So keep a copy of them. Don't just delete them thinking you got everything good. To generate new certificates, you run sbin, generate certificates, and then restart the host after installing the new files, and then you probably need to reconnect it to vCenter. For good measure, I'm going to show you the path to the vCenter certificates as well. So in case you get this on the lab, it doesn't actually say in the blueprint show you where these are, but I figure if I'm going to show you where the vSphere ones are, I better show you where the vCenter ones are. So they're under C, Program Data, VMware, VMware Virtual Center, SSL. So let's go first to this. So /etc/VMware SSL, not SLL. There's your two files, RUI cert and RUI key. So, make a copy of those. And have a copy before you change those out to other certificate files. And then, let's do vCenter. go to Explorer, C drive, program data, which is hidden, VMware, Virtual Center, SSL, and there's your RUI cert and your RUI key file. So there's where those are as well. That way you know where both sets are at. Lockdown mode. Lockdown mode provides a higher level of security. It's also extremely annoying. Basically, it says we're not going to allow any remote shell at all. The only way to manage this host is DCUI, plug keyboard and mouse into the front of the server, or hope you have remote lights out, which you probably do, or vCenter. If you lock yourself out of vCenter, you can't SSH in. You've got to get to the server and redo stuff manually. So it's enabled via the VI client, host config, software security profile. So host, configuration, software, security profile, scroll down to the bottom, lockdown mode, you hit edit, and you enable it. And it says right here, when enabled, lockdown mode prevents remote users from logging directly into this host. The host will only be accessible through local console, DCUI, or an authorized centralized management application, vCenter. This is my favorite line in vCenter, I think. If you're unsure what to do, leave this box unchecked. I love that line, because it's basically like, if you don't know what you're doing, don't do this, because you can lock yourself out of your host. But that's how you enable lockdown mode. And again, you can do it from the DCUI interface. Use it wisely, because you can lock yourself out. I've seen people have to rebuild hosts like this. Just be careful. SSL timeouts are fairly simple. Idle timeouts are set for two types of connections. Read timeout setting applies to connections that have completed the handshake process on 443. Basically, that means that it's established an SSL connection, and it's just a kind of an idle timeout. The handshake timeout applies to connections that have not completed the SSL handshake. So it's something that's connected on 443, but we haven't completed the SSL key exchange and all that good stuff. So it's like a half-open kind of connection, almost like a send request, but a bit more than that. Read timeout is for a completed handshake. Handshake timeout is for one that is currently undergoing the process. You change these by editing the ESXi VMware host D config XML file. Use an editor such as VI, edit the file, and add these lines. And then you change it, save your changes, close the file, and restart the host D process. This is one of these odd things that I have never ever changed on a host, but it's in the blueprint, so know how to do it. But I've never ever had to do this on a host. But hey, why not, right? Host D, and you add it to this big list of XML goodness in here. So there's nothing in here to kind of base it on. You just save that file, restart host D. So this is also in, of course, the documentation set. I would suggest you just know where it is, so you can go look up the handshake timeout in milliseconds and the read timeout in milliseconds. Again, it's milliseconds, so if you get something on the lab and says, hey, set this to 20 seconds, make sure you convert that to milliseconds. That's why I have 20,000, but that's your lines. Password policies. Oh man, I hope you don't get this question, because this is annoying. ESXi uses the PAM password qc.so plugin. PAM is password authentication module. It's basically a Unix Linux way to plug in authentication modules to allow extensible authentication like two-factor authentication and things like that without having to rewrite the entire stack of authentication libraries. That's all you need to know about that. But to actually change these, you change the default password complexity by editing this file, /etc/pam.d/password. The line you're looking for is password requisite /lib/security/isa/pam password qc, and then it's retry equals n, and min equals n0, n1, n2, n3, n4. So let me show you that file real quick. Let's see, pam.d. I'll just cat it. So here's the line that you care about. So what it says is, by default, this is default config, you get 3 password retries, and then your minimums by default are 8, 8, 8, 7, and 6. I'll show you what 8, 8, 8, 7, and 6 mean in a second, but what this is basically saying is, depending on your password complexity, the minimum number of characters in your password will go down. So the simplest password requires 8, and the most complex password with the most different funky characters will let you get by with 6. So options for the complexity. Retries a number of times. A retry can retry a password that does not meet requirements. And then N0 is a number of characters required for a password that uses characters from only one class. So if you type in nothing but a lowercase password, you've got to have 8 characters. If you use number of characters required for a password that's 2 classes, so uppercase and lowercase, you still are 8 characters by default. Remember, it's 88876. N2, used for pass phrases, basically specifies the number of words in a phrase. I guess you can put spaces in it. So if you're going to use a pass phrase, number of words, by default it's 8. Number of characters required for a password that uses 3 classes, uppercase, lowercase, and a number, for example, you can get by with 7. Number of characters required for a password that uses 4 classes, uppercase, lowercase, number, and punctuation, it'll let you get by with 6. And then there's match, number of characters allowed in a string that is reused from old password. I believe that's an optional setting that's not in the default. So it says basically if you just try to increment a number in your password by 1, it'll catch you on that, but that's an optional item. So again, this is, I guess it's simple, but either memorize this or again look it up in the documentation set under the security stuff and if you need it. ESXi firewall. This is fairly simple. It seems complicated at first, but it's really not. You manage the firewall via either the VI client or the CLI using ESXi network firewall commands. It depends on which one you're faster at. You can actually get by pretty quick using the CLI on this one. Basically, you can enable it, which is the default. So ESXi network firewall set -enabled is what -e is for. -enabled true. Or if you want to disable the firewall, ESXi network firewall set -enabled false. You would think you would do set -disabled, but you're setting the enabled key as either true or false, so remember that. There are 2 security levels. This is one of these odd things in the blueprint. I can't remember exactly how it's worded, but there actually used to be settable default security levels within the ESXi firewall. It used to be, I believe, high, medium, and low. Now there's really only high and low. And they still spell this out in the blueprint, and I think they just copy and pasted part of the blueprint from the older exam. But here's how it works. So if default action is set to block, then the level is high, which is the default. If the default action is to allow, then the level is low. If you set it to allow, you would then go in and block things you didn't want. By default, you have to open things you do want. So you can basically check this by doing ESXi network firewall get, and it gives you the default action. The medium setting used to be, I think it was inbound was blocked and outbound was allowed by default. But we don't have that option anymore. It's just the way it is. So to see the option, you do ESXi network firewall get. Changed using the ESXi network firewall set --default -action, and then you can set it to, I believe it's drop and allow. So let's take a look at that real quick. So ESXi network firewall get. So by default, my action is dropped, so I'm on really high security, which is awesome, and it's also enabled and it's loaded. So I can do set --default action, and let's see. Oh, it's pass and drop. So remember that. So if I want to set that to pass. Oh, what is it? It's, set true. That's it. And false to drop. This is the worst because it's like set to true to set the default action to pass. Why don't you just set it to pass? So true. There we go. Standardization, I tell you. So now the default action is pass, so I'm low security. So let me change that back. False. Back to high security. Simple stuff. And then you can do --enabled or -e, and again you set that to true to enable or false, and we're now disabled. So that's fairly simple. It's the default action that always gets me, and we're back. Default services. So there's a bunch of services in ESXi already set up. A service is a protocol configuration. Basically it says inbound ports and outbound ports allow or deny. So it's a firewall. That's just kind of what it does, right? But those are built in, and the built-in ones can be enabled or disabled in the VI client or via the CLI using ESXi network firewall rule set set dash rule set and the name SSH server enabled true. So let's see if we can muddle our way through that command. Let's see, ESXi network firewall rule set. If you want to list the rule sets, there's your list, and it tells you if they're enabled or not. And then we want to do, let's see, set, and then we can do dash dash rule set dash ID equals the ID, so we'll do FDM, and you can then, let's see, says it right, and then you can set to enable it, so dash dash enabled equals, let's see, it's true right now, so let me set that to false. Rule set list, and FDM is now closed. So let me turn that back on, but that's how you enable or disable it via the CLI. And get rid of my error here. Hey, that's funny. My host went down. Not responding. It may not have liked it when I was playing around with the rules earlier. Let's see. Configuration. And firewall rules. Let me move this to the right. Firewall properties. And then you could just come in here and check or uncheck each thing that you want to allow or deny. But this gives you kind of an idea of what a rule looks like. So for the DNS client, incoming port is 53, outgoing is 53. Your incoming and outgoing ports may be different. You may do TCP only, UDP only, or both. It just depends on the built-in rule set. And you can configure these, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. Oh, I know why that guy's dead. I use a USB thumb drive to boot him from, and it's going bad, and every so often that machine purple screens. So I bet that's what happened. Nothing to see there. So to do custom services, you actually create some new files. So the descriptions or the config files for the services are stored in /etc/vmware/firewall. To add a new service, you create a new XML file. Name it whatever you want to name it. myservice.xml, whatever you want to call it. And for an example, look at the one that exists. So if I believe this one exists if you enable HA, because this is the fault domain manager file. It's a /etc/vmware/firewall fdm.xml. And you may need to enable the FDM, like I said, to see this file. And we'll look at this file here in the lab. Once you create these, you need to refresh the firewall rules. So you do ESXi network firewall refresh, and then do ESXi network firewall rule set list to make sure it shows up. Back to the lab. So etc vMware firewall. And there's our FDM. So first of all the default ones that we saw are in this service.xml file. They're just spelled all out, and they're numbered. So service ID number 2, service ID number 4, they each have a unique number, and then they have some config information, much like the FDM one. Actually, let's make this a little more clear. That all starts running together. So here's the config for FDM. It's basically config root, service, and the ID name. The ID is what shows up in your rule set list. So when I enabled and disabled FDM a minute ago, it showed up in the rule set list as FDM because that's what it says right there. Then within this, you can have multiple rule IDs. So each rule ID specifies an inbound or outbound port and protocol. So rule ID 0 is inbound TCP destination of 8182 for the port number. Rule set 1 is outbound TCP destination, which is almost, I guess, the same, 8182. 02 is inbound UDP port 8182, and 0003 or 0003 is outbound UDP 8182. So each rule is one port. Well, I take that back. You can do a range if you want to. Let me do services. Let me find one with a range. Destination. Yeah. So here's one with a range. Rule set 000, outbound TCP, port, begin, and end. So these ports are from 0 all the way to 65.535/port. So if you need one, if you get a question on the exam and say, hey, create a new rule, and it's got to be a port between 8,000 and 9,000, look in your services XML for a description or an example of one to use for that. But again, for FDM, it's pretty simple. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. So now let's create one of our own. So the easiest thing to do first is copy FDMs. So vcap and then edit it. Told you need to know how to use VI. So first thing I want to do is change the name. So do insert, which is I. Oh, wait. Down here it says it's read only. Let me show you how to fix that. As soon as I learn how to type again. There we go. ls-al, it shows that my vcap XML, and I don't know if you know how to read Unix permissions, but I'll show you. So what you see here are three groups of permissions. This file is set read, read, and read. Every file, every directory in Unix has three sets. It's user, group, and everyone else. So user is root. My group is also root because we don't have a membership in a group, and then everyone else is also read. The way you set permissions is chmod, and that's just the command. And you do it using numbers is the easiest way. So actually, yeah, the easiest way is probably numbers. There's a couple of ways to do it, but these are binary. So you're going to set this using three numbers, actually. And that is not the permission of the beast. It's just what it happens to be. So each of these is three numbers. So let's look at this guy right here, and I'll try to simplify. Try to simplify this. So read, write. The three dashes are read, write, and execute. R, W, and X. So from the right, execute is a 1. Think of binary. Write is a 2. Read is a 4. So right now, this permissions are set for 4, 4, 4. That means read, 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 because 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4. If I want to set them to read and write, it would be 4 and 2, which is 6, 4 and 2 is 6, 4 and 2 is 6. So let's say I wanted to set this to read and write for roots, user, and group, but still leave it as read for everyone. It would be 664 vcap read, write, read, write, read. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. If in doubt and you get on your exam and you don't know how to edit a file, just do 777. That's actually read, write, and execute. That's why it turns green. You can't actually execute an XML file, but you flagged it as executable. But the proper way to do it would be 664. So let's edit that. Now it doesn't say read only. So let's change this X to delete, I to insert, and we'll call it vcap rule. Then we could go through and change these ports to whatever we want. 9876, 1212, whatever. Whatever your exam question may tell you to do. Again, if it tells you to do a range, edit the services XML and get an example. If it's you don't need all four because it says, hey, do a range from 8 to 9000 TCP only, you need to delete the ones for UDP. But this one is TCP and UDP. So we'll save it. Then we run ESXi network firewall rule set list. ESXi network firewall list. Notice down at the bottom there's no vcap. So rule set, let's see, firewall refresh, which refreshes the rule set. I wish it would be rule set refresh, but for some reason it's not. It'd be more simple. Simpler, I guess is the right word for that. Rule set list, and we now have our vcap rule. So if you get this question on the exam and you make a change and run this refresh, make sure you run a rule set list and make sure your rule set shows up. Okay? Because if it doesn't show up, you probably won't get points for that. And then if you need to enable it, you can do that. ESXi now rules firewall rule set -r vcap rule -e true list, and it's now enabled. To do this from vCenter, you can't add a rule set from vCenter. This was Optimus. Configuration, security. Do a let's see if it shows up. I don't think it will. Nope. So there's no vcap in that list. Oh yeah, there is. It already refreshed it. If it doesn't show up, hit refresh. Make sure it shows up in this list like vcap rule. Properties. Scroll down. vCap rule and enable it here. So make sure it shows up, because if it doesn't show up, you probably missed something in the config, and I don't want you to lose points because you did a great job up to that point, but somehow you messed up something in that XML file and it's not happy with it. So I'm a big fan of being able to confirm and check things when I do it. And then also confirm, I think it's easier to look at this stuff in here than it is a CLI, properties list. VCAP, yep. Make sure your ports, incoming and outgoing, look correct. Make sure your TCP UDP looks correct. So again, that's a great way to do it. Also on the firewall, I hit on this before, and we'll hit on it again. If it says, hey, create a firewall services rule, enable it, and only allow IPs from certain subnet to do it, you come in here and you only allow the IPs, and you type those IPs in here. You can also do that again from the CLI. That's a set command. And it's basically to allow an IP list, and you can set an IP list. And there's your allowed IP range to list and remove IPs. So allowed IP, and then you add, list, or remove. I think that's easier done in the UI, but you can do it there. Service behavior, I already hit on this when we talked about it earlier, but there's a couple of ways to handle the ports. Start automatically if any ports are open, and stop when they're closed. Start and stop with host, and start and stop manually. We talked about those. So if you get a question that say, hey, create this rule, allow these IPs, and make sure when the host boots that service is allowed, you'd want to start and stop when host. If it says, hey, create this, do this, and make it so that you have to manually enable and disable that port as needed and not needed, that'd be start and stop manually. So those are probably your big ones there. And again, you do those under each of the individual rules. And you can change it on a per service basis. Like I just said, it's on the individual rule. Hardening VMs, this is a wide open blueprint entry. I hate these, right? I'll give you a couple of things, and then I have no idea how they would test you on this. First, treat VMs as physical servers. Use antivirus, use malware, apply the necessary guest OS patches. You probably know this. There is a vSphere hardening guide. It's very good. It's also extremely nitpicky because it's a security hardening guide. It's probably worth skimming over. It's not included in the vSphere documentation set, so I don't think they're going to quiz you on it. But it's probably worth at least perusing through if you get a couple of minutes. I don't know what they're going to ask you out of it because you'd have to memorize the whole thing because you're not going to have access to it. But it's at least worth looking at. So log files, I mean, we've hit log files a few times in this course, but we'll talk about them again. For security messages, var log VM kernel, network port changes, and other items. Shell is probably your big one, so it logs all commands. So as we go through and enter commands, they go to the var log shell.log. So, tail -50, again, to look at the last 50 lines. And if you notice, actually, that is not the last 50 we ran on here. So cat shell.log. That's funny. Those are the ones we did from the other lab. Interesting. Actually, I may not do it until I log off. Let's log off. Nope. Well, it's supposed to log all your shell commands. For some reason, it's not updating to show mine. That's my data stores. No, for some reason it's not. But if you get asked to make a copy of a log that shows where everything is executed, it'd be var log shell.log. And AD integration. So you can join each of your hosts to an Active Directory domain. Do this with the VI client. Format for entering the domain is just name.top-level-domain. So like for me, it's nashlab.local. And the account is created under the default container. So if you want to do this a little different, you can create under a particular OU. So you would do name.tld/container/path. So nashlab.local/OU1/child-OU. That's how you enter that in. So let's look at that. That is under authentication services. So host, configuration, authentication services. Properties. And you would change it from local auth to Active Directory. Give it the name, nashlab.local. Assume your DNS is right. Assume your time sync is correct. Hit join domain. I guess I just really need administrator. And let's see if that actually works. Wait for it. Okay. That's weird. It bumped me back. And it's done. I've joined Nash Lab domain. So it's simple. Reason you want to do that is you can pull in users for permissions and things from AD and not have to create them all local. So it now has trusted domain controllers and all that good stuff. But it's a quick and easy way to add it to AD. And then there's the vSphere authentication proxy. All right, this is listed specifically in the blueprint. I am hesitant to go too deep in the authentication proxy. The blueprint actually says, I think it said configure the authentication proxy, which is actually very simple. There's not a whole lot you need to do. So I'm going to walk you through some of the steps for this, and then I'm going to show you why I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on this. The authentication proxy is a proxy between vSphere and Active Directory. So let's say you don't want to add your vSphere host to AD for whatever reason, but you still want them to be able to pull AD information. That's what the proxy's for. The proxy runs on a machine that's part of the Active Directory domain, and then the vSphere hosts point to the proxy. The reason you would do this is for auto-deploy. So if I'm auto-deploying host, every time I boot, I auto-deploy, grab an image, boot up, get my config on a host profile. Well, I can't easily join the domain every time. It's going to cause problems. So what you do is you point it to the proxy. That works fine. That way there's no AD credentials needed with the host configuration. They don't have to be stored anywhere. The reason I'm hesitant to show you this is because there's a lot of certificate things, not a lot, but there's some certificate things you have to do if you're going to use this without auto-deploy. This is actually far easier to use with auto-deploy than without auto-deploy. And I've yet to talk to anybody who's really got this functioning well without having to go, through a lot of troubleshooting and things outside the documentation to get this to work outside of using auto-deploy. So I'll show you some of it, but it's not going to work in my lab because I don't do auto-deploy. So we'll look at it. You add the proxy to Active Directory and not the individual hosts. Steps. These are the steps right out of the manual for this, and they leave some things out, which annoys me because the steps actually look fairly simple, and then we get into some additional complexities that aren't spelled out until you go through the documentation. So first of all, on a host machine where you're going to install this, which is basically a Windows system, install .NET 3.5. Simple enough. What they're not going to tell you is you also need to install IIS. And what they're also not going to tell you above that in the documentation is you need to install IIS and some submodules. Well, they don't tell you the submodules. So what I end up doing, is I start the install for the proxy, and it says, hey, you need to go install IIS. I'm going to cancel out of the install till you get done. That's literally what it says. Well, not literally, but that's all it says. So I go and I add IIS to the server. Go back to the proxy config or install, start going through. It says, hey, I see you have IIS installed, but you don't have these 6 or 8 submodules installed. Go install those, and it lists them out. So then I go back to the IIS config. I add the 6 or 8 submodules. It's good to go. Then I go back into the install again. So it's like takes me 3 times because it's actually not listed in the documentation. Then you install vSphere Auto Deploy. I don't think you need to do this if you're not using Auto Deploy, but it literally says this in the step, install Auto Deploy. You don't have to install it on the same host as the authentication proxy. It just has to be installed. So I'm not sure if it's because it needs a plugin, the plugin for vCenter does something, or it just is assuming that you're going to use this with Auto Deploy. It's not spelled out in the documentation, and this is not documented well anywhere, which is one reason this annoys me that it's on the blueprint. But to install Auto Deploy. Add the host machine where you install the authentication proxy to the domain, and then use the domain administrator account to log into that host machine. 5, in the software installer directory, double-click auto run. So what they mean by that is go run auto run off your vCenter install files. It's listed as an option in the installer for vCenter where you do like update manager and all the other stuff. You'll see authentication proxy. Then you select vSphere Authentication Proxy and click Install. Follow the wizard to complete the install. If you don't get the IIS components right, it will tell you which ones to install. And then during installation, the authentication service registers with vCenter where Auto Deploy is registered. And then you're just supposed to go and add your vSphere host to AD and select use a proxy. Unfortunately, they leave out a bunch of other steps. You have to do some IIS configuration. You have to do some certificate copies. If you're using this without auto deploy, you have to actually create self-signed certificates or get them from another certificate authority and copy them over, or it doesn't work. So let me show you some of that real quick. So first, let's take a look at a couple of things. I'm going to make an assumption, and I may not be correct, but my assumption would be this is a fairly complex installation. I have a hard time believing that they're going to ask you to install this as part of a lab. That's usually kind of outside the scope of all this because, like I said, you got to do certificates and you got to do a bunch of other stuff. So I would assume they're going to ask you this. They're going to ask you some basic configuration ideas or basic configuration items for the authentication proxy. One would be add a vSphere host to AD using an existing proxy. So to do that, you click your host, go to config, go to authentication services properties, just like we did a minute ago. Choose AD, tell it the domain, and then select this box for proxy. And the one I have is on .161. And say join domain, and mine's going to error out most likely. So give this a second, and we'll see what happens. Yep, that's what I thought was going to happen. It says it's not reachable or has denied access to the service. Basically means I believe that my certificates are incorrect because, again, I'm not using this with auto deploy, and all the documentation in the VMware communities say that's what happens when your certificates are wrong or there's a bunch of other stuff to troubleshoot. But that should go through. The other thing that you may need to do is import a certificate. All right? So there are certificates, and the way you get this, and I'm going to walk you through a little bit of it, is first I'm going to look at my host, and I've got the authentication proxy installed on this system. There's really nothing to look at. VMware, that's just tools. Yeah, there's nothing there. But it is installed here. And the way you install it, again, is through the vCenter, through vCenter's install file. So I'll show you those real quick. vCenter C drive, because I want to show you as much of this as I can. Users, if I remember what I'm doing, desktop, vCenter 5.1, run my auto run, and it is right here. So under support tools is VMware vSphere authentication proxy. Click that, click install. The install is dead simple. Again, it's going to tell you that IIS is installed, so go install that. Then it's going to tell you which your modules aren't installed, install those. And that kind of varies on the version of Windows you're installing them on. So again, I don't think they're going to ask you to do this because that's kind of Windows administration, but it's got to be done. And then once that's done, you can walk through this, and it's literally next, 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 next. You'll give it the vCenter information and everything for a plugin. You want to make sure that your plugin is enabled. Go to Manage Plugins. VOps, Authentication Proxy. Let me re-enable that. And make sure that that's enabled. Let me try logging in again. Still not going to work. And yeah, it's going to fail. So, but make sure you do that. And then the next thing you need to do is import a certificate. Well, I'll show you where the certificate comes from, but I don't think they're going to ask you to do it. Under IIS Manager, you go to Sites, you go to the Computer Account Manager, CAM as it's called, click that, you go to Bindings, HTTPS, Edit, View the Certificate, go to Details, Copy to File, Next, Do Not Export Private Key, Next, Base 64, Next, and then give it a file name and it'll dump out a key, which I have actually already done. And the name of that key is, let's see, and you need to save that key to a machine somewhere and put it on a data store. And I'll show you why you got to put it on a data store here. But you save it to a data store, and the reason is when we import the key is not importing to vCenter. The key is importing to the vSphere host. So the vSphere host has to have access to it. What does the vSphere host have access to? it has access to a data store. So I have it on data store 1, and I'm trying to remember what I named the key. Test.cert. Yep, test.cert.text. So the way you do this, oops, that's not it. This is it. You go import certificate, and it says give me the path. So the path is bracket data store name bracket and then a path. But mine is test-cert.text and then the IP of the authentication proxy. And you'll say import, and then it says invalid data store path because I must have given it the wrong one. Let's see. Nope. Oh, that's vCenter, that's why. Too many windows. Test-cert.text. Is that the right name? Yep, test-cert. So we'll try again. Import certificate. Oh, data store 01. Test-cert.text. Again, it didn't like that. What didn't you like? Oh, what don't you like? VMFS, volumes, data store 1. .sir, Windows was hiding that. Darn you, Windows. Data store 01, because I forgot it puts that on the end of it. Test-cert.text, and the IS Manager added that to the end of it. So that's a good gotcha for the exam. It'll go and it'll complete the installation of the certificate. So at that point, we should be able to join. I probably should have shown you that first, because before you do that, you actually cannot join. And again, it throws an error. But that is really that, doing your certificates, and one other thing in the documentation, which is back to IIS Manager. You come over to IP address and domain settings, which is or domain restrictions, which is one of those things that submodules you had to add. You have to allow the IP range that you're using for your vSphere host. So add allow entry and just put an IP range with the net mask here. That's in the documentation. That is not spelled out in the overall steps. And there was one more, I think. Maybe that was it. I think that's it. Yeah, that's basically it. So let me run through that again for you to make sure you kind of understand all my convoluted explanations. You'll have a Windows server. You join it to AD. You install the authentication proxy. It's going to tell you to install IIS, so you go install IIS. Then you're going to run it again. It's going to tell you which submodules for IIS you need to install. Then you go add those. Then it'll install. Also, don't forget .NET 3.5. But then you'll install it. It'll ask you for your vCenter IP and login so it can install the plugin here. So once it's done, make sure you enable the plugin. If you want to check your plugin, you can go out to Home, to Authentication Proxy, and it'll give you the information. Then you need to do some certificate stuff, and honestly, that is spelled out in the documentation guide for the Authentication Proxy. It's part of the install guide, I believe, document, but it tells you which files to copy. It's basically the SSL certificates I showed you in the ESXi VMware SSL directory. Hopefully, if you're doing a lab and they ask you for that, they're going to have to provide those to you because they have to generate them. Then you want to go to the IIS setting or whatever web server they're using, probably IIS. Export that certificate, put it on a data store, import it here. Remember, got to use data store notation. Import, then come to properties, add to AD, give it your domain, select that, and give it the IP. Or, if you use host profiles and auto deploy, you don't have to do the manual certificate work. It uses a certificate in the host profile, and it's all done for you, which is why it's simpler. So I wish I had a better explanation for you on the authentication proxy, but I went back and forth and tried to decide if I wanted to do an hour class on that or not, and I just don't think it's worth it, because in these questions, they're not going to have you install something, especially if you've got to manage. At least I can't imagine you have to do anything outside of inside of IAS or Windows administration. It's just outside the scope of this exam. But what I would know how to do is install the proxy, which is just literally going to your vCenter install files and click next, 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 and adding the plugin. I would know how to import the certificate on each host here. If they give you the certificate, say on the vCenter desktop, and you're like, what do I do with it? The easiest thing to do is go to Storage, here, right-click, Browse Data Store, and use the Data Store browser to upload the certificate to the data store. Then come back to your config on the host and do import certificate on each one. And then I would know how to add a host to AD. I'll be surprised if they make you do that with the proxy, since it's got to be a working config, but I definitely know how to do it just from a basic add to AD for each host individually, and know how to do that. So again, I wouldn't spend too much time on this. This is a piece of vSphere that most people don't even know exists, the authentication proxy, and I have never seen it used in a production environment. So back to the slide decks after that wonderful information. And that's it for this lesson. So don't get bogged down in these last 3 slides on the proxy. Do hit the information, especially on firewall. Man, that's good stuff, because I talk a lot about things that can be graded, things that provide output, and that's firewall rules can provide output, especially custom services. Changes to any of the config files that we talked about, those are definitely things that can be graded. Any of the other timeout settings, any of that stuff definitely can be graded. So make sure you know how to do all of that. And then just know the general overview steps for the AD proxy, but definitely know how to add a vSphere host manually to Active Directory. So that's it for this lesson and all these labs. We'll keep going, and I hope to see you on the next one.